Good afternoon. It is an honor for the Permanent Mission of Honduras to be opening this event as co-sponsor with the Permanent Mission of Estonia, the Permanent Mission of the Ukraine, and the non-governmental organization United Nations Watch. I am delighted that we're able to broadcast globally, thanks to UN webcast services, to rights activists, thought leaders, diplomats, journalists, and among the viewers are courageous Venezuelans in the country and throughout the world who are fighting for respect of their human rights. The partnership and collaboration of the international community, diplomats, and civil society is with the intent to bring light to an important issue that will create a new awareness, conscientiousness, and awakening. This is a conversation on human rights matters in Venezuela, and it may not be an easy conversation, and it will touch at the core of our humanity. On April of 2006, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 60/251, establishing the Human Rights Council. The resolution in its Article 8 states that the General Assembly, I quote, decides that the membership in the Council shall be open to all state members of the United Nations. When electing members of the Council, member states shall take into account the contribution of candidates to the promotion and protection of human rights and their voluntary pledges and commitments made thereto. The General Assembly, by two-thirds majority of the members present and voting, may suspend the rights of membership in the Council of a member of the Council that commits gross and systematic violations of human rights. End of quote. Article 9 states, I quote, decides also that members elected to the Council shall uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights, shall fully cooperate with the Council, and be reviewed under the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism during their term of membership. End of quote. The General Assembly members have a responsibility to uphold Resolution 60/251 and the stature of the Human Rights Council. The lack of due diligence, enforcement, and compliance of the resolution has resulted in a situation of exasperated conflict and escalation of human rights abuses. Reports of the Human Rights Commissioner and the United Nations Independent International Fact-Finding Mission found there are systematic, serious, and grave violations of human rights and crimes against humanity taking place inside Venezuela. The country has not been able to hold free, fair, credible, and transparent elections, being the only pathway to peace and means to create favorable conditions for human rights, human development, and economic recovery for the Venezuelan people, its neighborhood, and for the region. The General Assembly must act accordingly and remedy the situation, and the United Nations system utilize all its mechanisms to bring a new era of peace to Venezuela. May our calls in favor of a system that works and ensures human rights and dignity be heard, and actions be taken at every level to fulfill on the Charter and Declaration of Human Rights. I look forward to the participation of our distinguished panelists. They are Luis Almagro, Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Maria Corina Machado, leading Venezuelan democracy activist and leader, Diego Arria, former Venezuelan ambassador to the United Nations and president of the Security Council, Professor Irwin Cutler, chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, member of the Organization of American States Inquiry on Venezuela and the ICC, former Canadian Minister of Parliament, Minister of Justice, and Attorney General. I now have the honor to invite Hillel Neuer, Executive Director of UN Watch, to introduce our high-level panel of experts and moderate this event. Mr. Hillel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Flores. I want to begin by recognizing your leadership in organizing this very important event in support of human rights for the people of Venezuela, and to thank all of the co-sponsors, the Permanent Mission of Honduras to the United Nations, the Permanent Mission of Estonia, and the Permanent Mission of Ukraine. Our human rights organization, UN Watch, is honored to be organizing this event together with the state co-sponsors, and we would like to also thank the United Nations for hosting this event on UN TV and broadcasting it live now around the globe. Before I say a few words about how the United Nations is addressing Venezuela, allow me to introduce our distinguished panel. Our first speaker will be Maria Corina Machado, a leading opposition figure and founder of Vente Venezuela, a political party created in 2012. As a member of parliament, she has stood out as one of the strongest and most critical voices of the regime, speaking out about the humanitarian situation that is going on today and in recent years. After denouncing Nicolas Maduro before the Organization of American States in 2014, Ms. Machado was arbitrarily expelled from parliament in violation of due process. Since then, she has campaigned across Venezuela to spread a message of freedom, rule of law, and justice. Maria Corina Machado has been recognized internationally for her courageous work and was named by the BBC as one of the 100 most influential women in the world. Our second speaker will be Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, who was elected under the mandate of more rights for more people. A career diplomat, Mr. Almagro served as Foreign Minister of Uruguay and Ambassador to China after he occupied senior diplomatic posts in Germany and Iran. He has made human rights and promoting a more democratic, tolerant, and diverse society central to his diplomatic work. Indeed, we've had the honor of hosting him in Geneva as the keynote speaker of our Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy not very long ago. In 2014, Foreign Policy magazine named Mr. Almagro a leading global thinker, a distinction given only to 10 decision makers around the world each year. We will next hear from Ambassador Diego Aria, who previously served as Venezuela's permanent representative to the United Nations and as president of the Security Council. He famously launched the process that enables members of the Security Council to discuss informally issues of critical importance to international peace and security. Now known as the Aria Formula, it was introduced in 1992 in the midst of the genocidal war in Bosnia and has become a key element in the toolbox of Security Council proceedings. Last week, Ambassador Aria was recognized as an honorary citizen of Sarajevo for his work as a diplomat in exposing to the world the crimes that took place in Sarajevo and Srebrenica in the early 90s. He previously served as the governor of Caracas and in the National Congress. Today, he's an outspoken critic of the regime, and he heads UN Watch's global campaign to remove the Maduro regime from the Human Rights Council. Ambassador Aria is also a proud member of the UN Watch Advisory Board. Our panel will conclude with Professor Irwin Cutler. He is chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He's the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, served as Member of Parliament for many years. Professor Cutler is an international human rights lawyer. He served as counsel to prisoners of conscience from Nelson Mandela to Venezuelan political prisoner Leopoldo Lopez. In 2017, Professor Cutler was appointed to serve on the OAS independent panel of experts to probe the human rights abuses committed by the Maduro regime. The panel found the regime responsible for committing crimes against humanity and recommended the referral of Venezuela to the ICC, the first ever collective referral of a state party in the history of the court. Professor Cutler has been internationally recognized for his scholarship and advocacy. Indeed, Canada's national magazine, Maclean's, has referred to Professor Cutler as counsel for the oppressed. On a personal note, Professor Cutler was my teacher at McGill University when I was at law school, and he remains our inspiration for everything that we do at UN Watch to promote human rights and the rule of law. Now, after each one of these prominent and distinguished speakers delivers their remarks, we will have a brief Q&A discussion with each panelist. Before we begin the panel, let me just say a few words about how Venezuela is being treated at the United Nations. Let me begin with the good. The Human Rights Council, to its credit, appointed an international fact-finding mission that, in September, found extremely important conclusions. And I quote from their report this September. They found, quote, reasonable grounds to believe that Venezuelan authorities and security forces have since 2014 planned and executed serious human rights violations, some of which including arbitrary killings and the systematic use of torture, amount to crimes against humanity. I go on to quote, far from being isolated acts, these crimes were coordinated and committed pursuant to state policies with the knowledge or direct support of commanding officers and senior government officials. This is perhaps the most important statement ever delivered by the United Nations concerning the government of Nicolas Maduro. That is very good, and we're happy that the fact-finding mission was renewed for 2 years, and that we'll be hearing from them shortly in the Human Rights Council session that just began on Monday. Now, I wish it were only that. Unfortunately, there's also bad. At the Human Rights Council, a competing resolution was adopted, sponsored by Iran, which blames all of Venezuela's troubles on Western democracies for imposing sanctions against regime officials. That narrative that everything that's wrong with Venezuela is because of Western democracies and sanctions was recently promoted by a Human Rights Council expert. I'm referring to the Special Rapporteur on what's called unilateral coercive measures. This is a mandate created by Cuba to target Western countries, to make dictatorships look like victims. Alina Duhan, who's the Special Rapporteur, she visited Venezuela. One of the only experts that they allow to visit are those who are apologists for the regime, like a few years ago when they welcomed Alfred de Zayas, the same apologist type of work. And she delivered a report saying that all of Venezuela's troubles are the fault of Western democracies. This was picked up immediately by Maduro when he addressed the Human Rights Council on Monday. He quoted from her, and you could see how propaganda from this Cuban-appointed expert was used by Maduro. So this is what's wrong with the council that needs to be addressed. And the fact that just a year ago, the General Assembly elected Maduro to the Human Rights Council. This is outrageous. And it's something you'll hear more about from Diego Aria, who heads our campaign to remove Venezuela. And it brings me to the General Assembly. What is the General Assembly doing on Venezuela? The General Assembly has adopted some resolutions on countries, one on Myanmar, one on Syria, one on Iran, but zero on Venezuela. Why is the General Assembly silent on Venezuela? More, why did the General Assembly elect Venezuela, and when will they act, as Ambassador Flores mentioned, under their mandate 60/251 to remove a member that commits gross and systematic abuses? We'll hear more about that from Diego Aria. Finally, I'll mention the Security Council. The Security Council should be dealing with a situation where millions, 5 million people have fled Venezuela, creating trouble across South, Central, North America. This is an issue of international peace and security. Security Council should be addressing this as well. So I think there's a lot that the United Nations should be doing. With that, I want to go to our panel. I have the honor to invite our first speaker, Maria Corina Machado, to take the floor. Please.
You're muted, Maria. You're muted. Can you please unmute yourself?
Oh, okay. Now I can. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm really honored and grateful to have the chance to participate in this unique event. Thank you so much to the representative ambassador of Honduras, Lizy Flores, as well as the permanent missions of Ukraine and Lithuania for co-sponsoring this event. And it's really delightful to share with three individuals that are freedom fighters and inspiration to all of us in Venezuela, Almagro, Irwin, Cutler, and Diego Aria. And thank you, of course, to UN Watch for your commitment to the cause of freedom in Venezuela and being so close to us and speaking out the truth. I speak from the ground. I see and I feel the despair of a population that lives under terror, humiliation, discrimination, and misery. From the instant a Venezuelan awakes to the time he goes back to bed, he knows he faces a system without law and deprived of all his rights. He knows also that every single one of its human rights is or could be violated with no consequence whatsoever to its perpetrators. In Venezuela, a complex system of domination has been installed. The looting of the nation's resources by corruption, organized crime, narco-trafficking, and terrorism has led to the extreme that today Venezuela faces. Today, first, Venezuela is a failed state with no capacity whatsoever to give guarantees of human security. A whole generation is growing with malnutrition, without vaccines, without education, and even without their moms, their mothers. The severe humanitarian crisis that has produced the largest migration crisis in this hemisphere history is right now represents over 20% of our population, 6 million people. Second, Venezuela is an occupied territory. Over 60% of Venezuelan land is under the control of different groups, criminal groups, that exercise not only control of the territory, but of the economy and even social control. The violent clashes that among these criminal groups that are growing day by day represent a real and growing danger of an armed conflict that will create further devastation, losses of lives, and even a bigger wave of refugees and displaced. And third, Venezuela has a criminal state in power. It is not a conventional dictatorship. It is important to understand its true nature and its links with criminal networks, local and international. Maduro has been accused, as you have said, of massive and systematic violations of human rights, as well as crimes against humanity. The evidence has been widely exposed for years, in hundreds of courageous testimonies of victims and their families, and of course of the permanent and perseverance of human rights activists and organizations such as UN Watch and others. You mentioned those reports on behalf of the United Nations, but I think there are at least 5 ones I think it's worthwhile signaling. First, the report of the International Criminal Court of its chief prosecutor on December 14th, 2020, who approved moving to the third phase because it found grounds on crimes against humanity, such as imprisonment or other serious deprivation of physical freedom, of torture, of rape, and other forms of sexual violence, and persecution of a group based on political motivation. Second, you mentioned the report of the fact-finding mission of the UN on human rights on September 16 that effectively found serious ground that Maduro and his inner circle were material responsible of crimes against humanity. Third, it is worth mentioning the update of the report of the Secretary General of the Organization of American States that reaffirms that the regime has been committing crimes against humanity in Venezuela since 2014. Fourth, the reports of UN Special Rapporteurs of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And fifth, I think it's just to mention the tens of NGOs on human rights that have been denounced and tortured, such as the Casla Institute, or the displacement of Venezuela by the guerrilla, Colombian guerrilla, such as Fundaredes, or the violations of freedom of speech, such as Espacio Público, or the way especially women have been detained in social protests because of lack of services that had happened in the last month that have made Foro Penal. These are chilling numbers. The scale is huge, but sometimes statistics are cold and they bury the intensity of the pain of every single story, of every family, of every hope that has been destroyed. So I need to share this with you. I need to talk to you of what I've seen, of the victims that I've talked to, and share their pain and agony. Can you imagine the degree of despair of a Venezuelan mother in the state of Apure or Amazonas or Bolivar that resigns to give away her son to a guerrilla group because this group can give him what she cannot, food, feed him? Can you imagine the anguish of Diego Sarga, the son of Guillermo Sarga, a union leader of the refinery in Amway, who has been in prison? First, he disappeared for several days, but he's still in prison since November 20th because he alerted of the devastation for lack of maintenance of this operation, this facility, and he was accused of sabotage. Can you measure the indignation of Jose Gregoria and Elvira Pernalete, whose son Juan Pablo was killed on April 26, 2017. He was a student. He was 20 years old in the streets of Caracas by the forces and the repression of Maduro. What they felt when 2 days ago they saw Maduro, who's a culprit of his assassination, speaking at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. Believe me, you would never forget the glance and the degree of pain of Rosalia. She's a mother of a young Venezuelan who 2 years ago disappeared, and she's supposed to have drowned in a small ship that was taking a group of young women in a prostitution network from Paria to Trinidad. And she still wakes up every morning praying to know what has happened to her daughter. Can you imagine the pain of the wife and young children of Captain Rafael Acosta Arevalo, who was tortured to death by the regime, and he simply fell down dead in front of a martial military court? What else has to happen for an effective reaction to be put in place in order to stop this tragedy? How many more tortured, disappeared, silenced, or death? How many millions more of Venezuela have to run away from our country, taking their children in hunger? What has to be done? First of all, criminals ought to understand that there will be no impunity, that they will face justice and pay for their crimes. The accomplices of the tyranny that have benefited from its resources in other countries, and I'm talking even about other ideological linked groups or even governments, have been stopped, should be stopped. The tyranny should be called by its name. We are not facing a common or conventional dictatorship. We're facing a criminal conglomerate that systematically destroys Venezuela and represents the dangers of destabilization of the rest of the region. Can you imagine what it means that Venezuelan territory has turned into a safe haven for the Colombian guerrilla that dares to threat with murder the president of Colombia from our country? This terrible crisis will not stop with humanitarian aid, which we need, but has to be stopped with the dismantling of a criminal and mafia state. We Venezuelans won't stop. We will keep organizing and raising our voices, but we cannot do this alone. We need you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria Corina Machado, for your very powerful testimony. I have to tell you that, as you know, UN Watch has hosted numerous speakers, human rights activists, former political prisoners, whether it's Antonio Ledesma or the wife of Leopoldo Lopez, and so many others at the United Nations, at our Geneva Summit for Human Rights. But this is the first time that we were able to give a United Nations platform to someone like you, who's in Venezuela, living through the horrific atrocities that you've described, and your testimony is all the more powerful for it. Thank you for your courage and for your remarks.
Thank you.
With that, I would like to give the floor to someone who's been a great friend of the people of Venezuela from a very important international organization, Mr. Almagro, the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, colleagues, ambassadors, friends. Thank you to United Nations Watch and to the Permanent Mission of Honduras, to the United Nations for hosting today's event. It's always a pleasure to speak on a panel with my esteemed colleagues, Irwin, Diego, Maria Corina, Ambassador Flores, DC Jaleo. I'm glad to be joining you. The track record of the Venezuelan regime is well established: murder, extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detentions, and forced disappearances, torture, rape, and other forces of sexual violence. Wide-scale persecution and the forced displacement of millions of its citizens. These are the tools used by the regime in Venezuela, member of the United Nations Human Rights Council, to maintain power and social control over its population. Basic rights and fundamental freedoms have been stripped away, leaving citizens defenseless. Grand corruption and gross mismanagement by the regime has created a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale in our hemisphere. More than 5 million Venezuelans forcibly displaced from their homes, whether running for their lives as political exiles or in search of the most basic necessities for survival because their government has stolen their prosperity and left them without access to medicines, basic health care, or even food. We may never know the full toll this regime has taken on its citizens. Countless Venezuelans have lost their lives because they could not access basic health care or shelter or running water. Add to this the cost of a lost generation of youth whose development has been forever harmed by malnutrition and lack of access to education. All the while, those in power continue to amass personal wealth through grand corruption schemes, siphoning off wealth that should have been used for the Venezuelan people and profiting off the very programs intended to provide humanitarian assistance to their citizens. At the OAS, we have long been concerned with the deterioration that has taken place in Venezuela. A decade ago, its conditions were not altogether unique in the region. Yes, there were human rights challenges, yes, there were issues with corruption, but the quality of life for those living in the country was not dramatically outside the norm. This collapse was as deliberate as it was steady. When the regime lost the hearts and the minds of the people, it resorted to increasingly authoritarian practices. Independent democratic institutions were co-opted, corrupted, and dismantled in order to consolidate power in the hands of the regime. The military had to be owned, its loyalty bought and paid for, first through bribes, payouts, and shared control over state resources and assets, and then by making them complicit in the crimes of the regime, culpable for the perpetration of gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity against the Venezuelan people. It also makes a peaceful and democratic solution more complicated, as those with the most power to bring about positive change have been incentivized to prevent change at all costs. The abuses carried out by the regime in Venezuela are well documented. In 2016, I fulfilled my duties as Secretary General of the organization and invoked the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Between 2016 and 2017, I produced a series of reports documenting the deterioration of democracy, the alteration of the constitutional order, and the corruption of the regime that has fostered the humanitarian crisis that exists today. At this stage, there was little discussion of the situation in Venezuela outside the region. When the protests in the spring of 2017 demonstrated an increasingly violent and systematized pattern of abuses, it became apparent that we had to do more. With the democratic institutions captured and the rule of law all but eliminated, we needed to seek justice on the international stage. This is why in 2017, with the assistance of former ICC prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo, we established the OAS independent panel of experts, Irwin here part of it, and created a new process at the regional level to look into the issue of crimes against humanity in Venezuela. When in 2018 the independent panel found reasonable ground to believe that crimes against humanity had been perpetrated, we had one recourse to engage the International Criminal Court and call for them to open a full investigation into the situation. In the time since, the abuses have only increased in scale and intensity. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights expressed similar concerns in 4 reports produced in 2017, 2018, 2019, and most recently in 2020. These findings were again echoed in the September 2020 report of the United Nations Independent Finding Mission, who also found that crimes against humanity have been perpetrated. The figures documented are astounding. More than 18,000 extrajudicial executions, hundreds of instances of enforced disappearances, and hundreds of documented cases of torture. These are just what has been documented in a country that has criminalized the sharing of information that reflects negatively on the regime. Despite the obvious crisis, the International Criminal Court is still pending to act, and then we expect in the future a stronger action against this regime and act in order to stop these crimes against humanity. The OAS Permanent Council has also taken a leading role in seeking peaceful restoration of the constitutional and democratic order in the country and has passed 8 resolutions addressing situations of concern. In the wake of the overtly fraudulent presidential elections at the end of 2018, the OAS Permanent Council refused to recognize the legitimacy of Maduro's second term in June of that year. Moreover, the OAS General Assembly of 2019 voted to recognize the interim government as the legitimate authority in the country and in turn recognized the body as a legitimate representative of Venezuela at the OAS. The OAS has also tried to address the migration crisis through the creation of the working group to address the regional crisis caused by the Venezuelan migrants. Further, we are looking into the question of accountability. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the United Nations Human Rights Council, a council that was created as a beacon of hope that every individual around the world would be able to live their lives freely, free to choose how they want to live, free from coercion and without threat to their lives and safety. The Council was created with one singular purpose, the promotion and protection of human rights around the world. Its membership obligations are laid out clearly. The very purpose of a seat on the Council is to champion and to ensure accountability for human rights abuses taking place, with its greatest tools being its investigative and fact-finding powers that documented and shed the light of truth on many dark situations. It is a mockery of this principle. It is a mockery to the victims. It is a mockery to those that have been tortured, to those the relatives of those who have been extrajudicially executed, to have the regime sitting in the Human Rights Council. Diplomats and political appointees sit around tables in Geneva talking about the importance of human rights. Their colleagues back in Venezuela perpetrating torture at Boleíta or Ramo Verde, Helicoide, faithfully named Operaciones de Liberación del Pueblo, Operaciones de Liberación Humanista del Pueblo, carry out extrajudicial executions against those perceived as a threat. They are terrorizing the families of anyone who dares to speak up. The only threat in Venezuela is the threat posed by the authoritarian regime against its own people. These are individuals claiming to be human rights champions on the international stage and are some of the worst offenders within their borders. The Human Rights Council was created to prevent large-scale abuses from taking place. It was not created as a resting place for perpetrators or a shield for human rights abusers. Yet, when Venezuela sought out this chair, this is exactly what it was looking for. Their presence is an affront to what the founders of the United Nations system envisioned. The pursuit of justice for the Venezuelan people has been a long and arduous road, and any opportunity for recourse within its border has been all but eliminated. At the regional level, we have been seized with the crisis and actively pursuing a peaceful path to restore democratic and constitutional order. For ends that fall outside our mandate, we have sought support and assistance from the international community. We should not be alone in this, nor should we be the loudest voice demanding an end to the abuse and justice for its victims should be coming from the members sitting on the Human Rights Council, from the countries that hold the privileged position of acting as a voice and champion to the fundamental rights and freedom of all people. Listen to the victims. Listen to the relatives of those that have been murdered. Listen to those that have been tortured. Listen to those voices. Listen to the voice of those that have disappeared. Listen to the voices of those that have been killed. Otras voces cantan. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General Almagro. I want to thank you for your heartfelt remarks and for the leadership that you've shown on the international stage. You've shown what international organizations can do if someone steps up and shows responsibility. And I think you've been a model for what the United Nations has done at the Human Rights Council by establishing the fact-finding mission. And we hope that they will heed your example and take action, as we said, to remove Venezuela from the Human Rights Council. As you said, they don't meet the standards of membership. And we thank you for all your very important actions and your leadership, which I know that the people of Venezuela and human rights activists around the world look to. With that, I would like to give the floor to someone who has been one of our leaders at UN Watch for some years now. He's been at every event that we've organized when we went to New York to urge the United Nations not to elect Maduro, when we've had testimonies in Geneva. Whenever we need him, Diego Aria is there. He is a champion and a patriot for the people of Venezuela. They are fortunate to have him as their voice, and he's our leader in our campaign. And I have the honor to give the floor to Ambassador Diego Aria.
Gracias, Hillel. Thank you so much. You know, Ambassador, my dear friend, Ambassador Flores of Honduras, said at the beginning that this would not be an easy conversation. Listening to Luis Almagro, to Maria Corina, undoubtedly it is a very painful conversation for Venezuelans who are suffering and the ones who are witnessing in an increasing way that seems to be not to have an end. I want to thank very especially Ambassador Flores for the initiative and our friends, the ambassadors of Estonia and Ukraine, which shows that regardless of the geographical distance, we can be united through common values, in this case, the defense of human rights. When I represented a free Venezuela at the United Nations, we were leading participants in the conflicts of Yugoslavia, Somalia, Rwanda, Cambodia, Mozambique, Angola. It didn't matter where. Human rights were for us a universal subject of compromise to all of us. After I left the United Nations, I became an advisor to Kofi Annan, the Secretary General, exactly when the Human Rights Council was created and was presented to the General Assembly. In that time, before that, when I represented Venezuela, I refused to participate as a member of the Human Rights Commission, the way that was called at the time, which was presided by Iran. We thought was a mockery and affront to the human rights convictions of all the membership. But today, when you see that two days ago, Maduro, a narco-tyrant, was able to speak at the Human Rights Council, people are asking, how come a Council of Human Rights can invite to speak a person like Maduro? I think this is a point of reflection for the whole membership, but because Venezuela is there, or not Maduro is there, not Venezuela really, after defeating the oldest democracy in Latin America, Costa Rica. It should be a matter of reflection of what is wrong at the United Nations that in events such as that could take place. In February 1920, under the sponsorship of UN Human Rights and the most valuable participation of its director, Irwin, we started a campaign, a global campaign to suspend Maduro from the membership in the council. People said that it could not be done. The same thing was told to Hillel and his board years back, that Libya could not be suspended, and they were successful and Libya was suspended. Why? Because it was a case of gross violators of human rights. I don't have to repeat what so emotionally and rightly Maria Corina and Luis Almagro said today about the dimensions of the Venezuelan tragedy. Both the two consecutive High Commissioners of the United Nations, Prince Said and Madame Bachelet both have certified that crimes against humanity are being committed in Venezuela. But then the Human Rights Council sent in 2017 a gentleman, Mr. Sayas, and recently a lady from Belarus, Russia, not special, a very democratic country, that prepared a sort of a report a la carte for Maduro, so Maduro could use it as an issue of propaganda, which he did 2 days ago. I would like to present to you a couple of reflections. There was a Colombian named Pablo Escobar. Pablo Escobar was the world's most important narco trafficker. He did try to control Colombia. He couldn't. But amazingly, Maduro has been able, as a narco trafficker, been able to reach and become the head of the Venezuelan power. So what Escobar could not reach with all his wealth and power in Colombia, Maduro has achieved it in Venezuela. Where in the world is today a man that is a reward of $20 million for him to be in prison? Where in the world do you have the head of a government that has 2 sons in jail for narco traffickers? Where in the world do you have a man whose wife is accused also of crimes against humanity? Only in the Human Rights Council such a man exists. Nowhere else in the world. We have tried to explain to the members of the Human Rights Council that we wanted to save them from the embarrassment to be joined by a repugnant company of the representative of the narco tyranny in Venezuela. We have tried to explain to them that we cannot continue to be viewed as a normal Latin American traditional dictatorship. No, this is a super criminal narco tyranny, militarized with links to terrorists. Is precisely the opposite of what Kofi Annan had in mind when he proposed the creation of the Human Rights Council. And I was there to witness that. That was precisely the intention. It was not a good idea at all for the United Nations to celebrate its 75th anniversary, bringing a country to the tyranny of Maduro. I refuse to call to bring Venezuela, because that's not Venezuela that is sitting in the council. It's a criminal corporation allowed by the majority of the members of the United Nations, which really is should be a matter of great concern and reflection to the whole world, that the United Nations could bring such a regime to be a member, nothing less, of the Human Rights Council, which in my view should be more important politically, morally, and ethically than even the United Nations Security Council. Today, more than 60 countries do not recognize precisely this tyranny because they consider it to have violated human rights, not allow free elections, persecuting people. We have more people running from the country today as an exodus, bigger than Syria. That Syria has a horrible civil war. When we have another kind of war, it's difficult to define it how, but it's a country that people are running away for hunger, for persecution, for insecurity, which makes our case probably the most powerful case today that should be helped by the international community. My last point has to be with the campaign that we have. Hillel Neuer, with this UN Watch organization, have done more for us in the last 10, 15 years in Geneva than anybody else. And he asked me to head the campaign. This campaign has today about 180,000 signatures. We need more. I hope that the people who watch this program, this Zoom, will be able to sign this petition. We have to speak with a louder voice. We might not get what we want to suspend Maduro, but we must not fail in attempting to do it. I think it's a compromise of solidarity. And that's why Luis Almagro has been, I believe, our greatest defender throughout these years, because the ambassador of Honduras, Elizabeth Flores, have seconded and been solidary with everything we do. And now we have two countries geographically distant but close to us in human rights, like Ukraine, Estonia, supporting our case. It should be an encouragement for all the countries to follow that. We need more voices to be heard, and for that we need more signatures. And I tell the people, it is not a waste of time. It's never a waste of time to sign for something where your heart, your feelings are committed for a country that used to be prosperous, free, and help most of the other countries at the United Nations when they were in peril. I thank you very much, Hillel.
Thank you, Ambassador Arria, and I know that your campaign that you're leading with such passion and commitment is inspiring so many people. You've been able to receive blessings and encouragement and endorsements from so many people across Venezuela and indeed across the world. And it means a lot, and we have to continue with the campaign, and that's what this event is all about. With that, we've heard from testimony from Venezuela, from Ms. Machado. We've heard from the Organization of American States. We've heard from the former Venezuelan ambassador. We're now going to hear from someone who is not from Latin America, but someone who's been a tremendous voice and counsel and colleague of the Venezuelan human rights movement, Professor Irwin Cutler.
Thank you, Hillel, for your kind words and for organizing and moderating this gathering in such an exemplary fashion. My appreciation to Ambassador Flores and Honduras, and also to Estonia and Ukraine for being the supporting states for this very compelling occasion. And I want to join my colleagues, and I have to say that I found their testimony moving, compelling, and enormously impactful. And so I'm privileged to join them in the common cause which brings us together, to secure justice for the Venezuelan people and accountability for the human rights violators, for Maduro and those criminally complicit with him in the ongoing, as we meet, crimes against humanity, which makes Venezuela's presence on the Human Rights Council, as it has been mentioned, as shocking as it is contemptuous of a rules-based international legal order. Close to 4 years ago, as mentioned, I was appointed by the OAS with two of my judicial colleagues from Latin America to a panel of independent legal experts, as we were characterized, to look into whether there was a reasonable basis to determine that crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela. After ongoing examination of the documentary evidence and hearing the witness testimony, we came to the determination that there was a reasonable basis to conclude that 7 major crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela, including multiple murders and extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detentions and deprivations of liberty, egregious cases of torture, rape and sexual violence, forced disappearances, political persecution underpinning these crimes against humanity, and perhaps the worst, and has been referenced, the state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering, the weaponization of food and medicine, the painful escalation of infant mortality and maternal mortality, the return of what had been diseases that had been addressed and redressed, the return of preventable diseases. And so what we had are hundreds of thousands of preventable diseases and deaths. Indeed, as all my predecessors have spoken, we're not just talking here about abstract statistics or abstract crimes. With respect to each of these crimes against humanity, there is enormous individual and familial pain and suffering, enormous assaults on the dignity and the well-being of the Venezuelan people. And so 6 months after our report, 7 countries, including Canada, made the first ever collective referral of a state party to the International Criminal Court in the history of the International Criminal Court. And more recently, after reports and investigations, as well as been mentioned by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, but more recently there was released a landmark report by the OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro and the newly appointed Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect, Jared Genzer, in which they describe in compelling detail and document that these crimes against humanity, represented in the earlier reports and findings and conclusions of law therein, have increased in scale, in scope, and severity, and that the special prosecutors in action after the initial collective referral had actually emboldened the impunity in Maduro's Venezuela. In particular, the report determined, and I have to tell you when I report this, again, bear in mind the individuals behind these horrific statistics, that there are 18,093 extrajudicial executions carried out by state security forces, 15,501 cases of arbitrary detention and deprivation of liberty, 724 cases of enforced disappearances, and these have been intensifying, particularly in the last 2 years and as we meet. 653 egregious cases of torture, and I remember Justice Manuel Robles Ventura on our panel saying these were the worst cases of torture and human suffering in that sense that he had ever seen. The weaponization of rape and sexual violence as instruments of torture. And most important, the horrific state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering, where tens of millions of Venezuelans have endured this really unfathomable human suffering because and leading to a state-orchestrated humanitarian crisis. And so, in light of all the above, in light of the compelling and moving testimony of my colleagues, what is it that we can do? What action can we take? And may I outline in one-liners, given the understanding of our audience, what are the actions that can be taken? Number one, we need to call upon the special prosecutor to expeditiously open an investigation into these crimes against humanity. As Luis Almagro mentioned, the Venezuelan regime has been enabled to operate with impunity. Two, we need to initiate a complaint under the International Court of Justice against Venezuela, which is a state party to the Torture Convention, for its egregious cases of torture. Number three, we need to initiate prosecutions on the basis of universal jurisdiction in our respective countries. Number four, we need to continue to make, and our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights has been making these representations to the working group on the disappeared, given, as I said, the dramatic increases in the disappeared as we meet. Number five, we need to invoke the United Nations special procedures, particularly the United Nations UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and the independence of the judiciary, to unmask and expose the unrelenting persecution and prosecution of Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni, who has suffered unrelenting torture at the hands of the Maduro regime, and where she is, in her case, a looking glass into the ongoing assault of the Maduro regime on the rule of law, on the independence of judiciary, and on any sense of justice in Venezuela. Number 6, we should hold hearings in our respective parliaments, as we have done in Canada, to further unmask, expose, and hold accountable the Maduro criminal regime. Number 7 has been mentioned, to support the petition for the suspension of Maduro's Venezuela from the UN Human Rights Council. Number 8, to enhance Magnitsky sanctions targeting the major human rights violators. And now that the European Union has adopted Magnitsky sanctions, to intensify the use of this important resource for that purpose. Number 9, to establish an inter-parliamentary alliance on Venezuela, similar to the inter-parliamentary alliance that we have established with respect to China, and to use the good offices of the Parliamentarians for Global Action, and our Wallenberg Center has entered into a partnership with them with respect to utilizing their rapid response, emergency response team for the protection of human rights defenders and parliamentarians. Number 10, and moving to a close, we need an intergovernmental alliance of the democracies to combat the axis of repression involving Iran and Russia and China, which is buttressing the Maduro regime. And finally, we need to provide the desperately needed humanitarian relief to Venezuela's suffering people. As we move, and this is the overall compelling theme of all our remarks, as we move to secure justice for the Venezuelan people and accountability for the criminal violators. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cutler, for your very powerful remarks and for your concrete recommendations and remedies to move forward. I think you've given the international community very precise steps that they can take. And with that, I would like to invite the panel. I'm going to go through, to each panelist. And let me pose a few questions to the panel, and feel free to in the few minutes that you have, each of you, to respond to anything that you've heard in this discussion, anything you want to add, but I'll pose a few questions to the panel. One is that Chile and the Dominican Republic are the latest Latin American countries to join the EU-led so-called International Contact Group on Venezuela. This group has said recently that it expects difficult compromises from the opposition as it joins a broad dialogue with the Maduro government. So I'd like to know if our speakers think that the US and the European Union and other countries, are they doing enough on pushing back against the Maduro regime? Are they doing enough to support the Venezuelan opposition? What about other Latin American countries? Are they doing enough? Another question for the panel. In its report to the Council, the UN fact-finding mission put forward recommendations, one of which concerns the application of universal jurisdiction. Do the panelists think that individual countries could contribute to bringing justice for the victims of human rights abuses in Venezuela? Can individual countries play a role, such as through universal jurisdiction? And let me turn to Maria, if you want to respond to any of these. And a specific question for you. We heard recently from Maduro, when he spoke to the Human Rights Council, he said because of the health system, the incredible health system that he has in Venezuela, the pandemic, the coronavirus is all under control. You're on the ground. What are your thoughts? So I give the floor over to you, Maria. Corina, you have 3 minutes. I don't hear you. If you can unmute.
Yep. Okay, thank you so much. I'm honored to share with you, and I'm moved by the testimonies of Mr. Almagro, Professor Cutler, and Diego. Certainly, I think the U.S. and other countries in the Western democracies are not doing enough, definitely not enough. Certainly, there are voices and organizations that have made statements and have promoted initiatives that have helped the international community finally identify the true nature of the regime and recognize Maduro as what he is, a criminal. And certainly the Lima Group or the OAS with Mr. Almagro's leadership has been promoters of this way forward. We've seen the EU Parliament as well with strong statements, and we've seen the actions of certain departments of the US government, such as the Department of Justice or the Department of Treasury, that have made both the indictments or the sanctions that have shown the criminals in Venezuela that they are being watched and that justice is moving ahead. But certainly that's not enough. There are voices that do not want to understand what's going on in Venezuela, and there are some that, for different interests, are promoting an accommodation and even, I'd say, appeasement of the democratic forces. I cannot. I have to mention, for instance, what I believe is astonishing role of the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Joseph Borrell, who's been insistently talking about a new initiative or episode of dialogue, such as the 13 we've had before, and speaking in terms of two voices or two sectors in equal conditions, when we all know it's a criminal regime with the support of, let's say, geopolitical forces such as Russia, Iran, China, Turkey, just mentioned, and Cuba, certainly mentioned by Professor Cutler, against a whole society that it's not polarized, but it's terrified. So I think these initiatives have to be unmasked and have to be stopped. And I do think that we expect much more from parliaments, and certainly the universal jurisdictions that you mentioned and that was suggested by the task force. I think it would be a way forward to not only for the criminals to know that there will be justice and they will not tolerate this kind of behavior, but also for the victims. Hello, I mean, the victims today in Venezuela, only relief is seen both sanctions on one side and actions on the judicial system of international system. So I think this has to move forward. We need to get a resolution to the Venezuelan crisis. This won't get power voluntarily. We need to create a threat, a real threat that has which has the effect on kidnappers, because Venezuela is hostage of a kidnapper system that will the effect of letting go and understanding that on their own well-being, on their behalf, they have to facilitate a transition to democracy.
Thank you, Maria Corina. I'd like to turn to Secretary General Almagro. I'd like to get your input on the role of the international community. You're someone who's there doing so much. What more do you expect from the international community? A question about the UN. When Maduro spoke, he cited this UN expert who's problematic, who said that all of Venezuela's troubles are because of Western sanctions. What are your views on sanctions? I'd like to get some of your input or on anything else that's been said. Thank you.
I hope that when they talk about sanctions, they talk about the sanction imposed by the regime with corruption toll. The corruption costed Venezuela from $80 billion to $300 billion in estimation, different estimations that have been done. If you see that $80 billion is a Marshall Plan in actualized currency. So imagine how much it has costed Venezuela, without mentioning that cost to the Venezuelan people. Also, the cost of financing Cuban oil, the exports of of oil to Cuba. That parasite of the international community, living from always from some other living organism like Soviet Union before, and then the Venezuelan people now. The Venezuelan people have paid for that long enough, and so it's very funny when a special rapporteur related to sanctions doesn't mention these two cases that have costed more billions of dollars than any other even before. Sanctions, when we have started having them with in some general scale. You see, we started something like 1.5 years ago, no more than that. We have been denouncing the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela since 6 years ago, 5 years ago, long before any sanction was imposed on a general way. And this way of imposing a sanction of the PDVSA system was because, if you see how the traceability of that, it was because it was a system to money laundering of the drug trafficking in Venezuela. Practically every point of the scale was sanctioned because of that, and that is of course a heavy toll on the Venezuelan people too, because having to deal with organized crime, drug trafficking, illegal mining, that is costing Venezuela a lot. Why does exist illegal mining in a dictatorship? Because they can impose any legislation in order to have the mining as they want to have it. Why is it illegal? Because it doesn't have to go the resources that belong to the Venezuelan people. They never get into the budget. They are exported by these people in order to take profit for themselves. So that is another sanction that is imposed to the Venezuelan people. And it's funny that they don't talk about these sanctions to the Venezuelan people. So that is is what our investigations say, and I just always ask people not to say something like that in such a wrongful way, because it's definitely something that is affecting directly the interests of the Venezuelan people.
Thank you, Secretary General Almagro, for your contributions and your participation on this panel. I would like to turn to Ambassador Aria for any of your thoughts and comments on what has been said, what you expect from the international community, and your concluding thoughts.
You know, Hillel, Professor Cutler, who's been a great Canadian friend, together with you, who are also a Canadian, presented what he called the one-liners. One of the one-liners, I hope, because I think we have international participants in this meeting, would support the initiative that Professor Cutler has of bringing the case of torture of the regime before the International Court of Justice, where we believe there is a great potential for them to act, and to act faster than the International Criminal Court. The other thing is that the new appointment of Karim Khan as a new prosecutor at the National Criminal Court is a sign of optimism for us, because we know that the Venezuelan case has been unfairly postponed for such a long time, that it is time to act. And we believe that there is consensus within the court to actually expedite the Venezuelan case. And my last comment on that would be, again, to ask for the support of the international campaign to sign, to actually suspend Maduro. That will be a first step. If we are able to get enough votes at the General Assembly to suspend Maduro, it means that we have enough votes to actually oust him from the United Nations and liberate the member countries from the, I would say, the obnoxious and repugnant company of sitting together with the Maduro regime. And lastly, it's a comment that has to do with what Kofi Annan used to call the amoral equality. Still, the contact group, the European Union, and even the United States call us all the time, the parties must negotiate The victims and victimizers, they don't make a difference in one from the other. And that, of course, it makes it impossible for them to visualize correctly the situation that we are under. And that's to be under, you cannot call a criminal corporation the other party. Thank you, Hillel.
Thank you, Ambassador Aria. I would now like to give the floor to Professor Cutler. And Professor Cutler, you served on the OAS panel, as mentioned, on Venezuela, made reference to the ICC. I'd like to get any of your comments on what's been said, but also your sense of where the international community is after the conclusions that you came to, and be happy to get your input. Thank you.
Well, on one of the questions you put about the contact group, whether enough is being done by them, and it is that not enough has been done. Regrettably, Venezuela has fallen off the international radar screen. What we need at this point, and we don't have, is a sense of moral urgency and a sense of the necessity of the political will to act against what Diego has called a narco-criminal, tyrannical Maduro regime. We don't yet have, as I said, that sense of urgency and that compellability to act that is so necessary, and the contact group has to assume that. Secondly, you mentioned the issue of universal jurisdiction. I believe that states that have that authority should exercise it. And in fact, our Raoul Wallenberg Center has entered into a partnership with the Global Accountability Initiative headed up by Professor David Crane. They initiated such accountability initiatives with regard to Yemen and Syria. We need this kind of accountability initiative with regard to Venezuela, and universal jurisdiction as a part of it. Number three, to invoke the panoply of legal remedies that are available and that need to be exercised. You mentioned the ICC. Frankly, it's shocking that the ICC has yet to open an investigation of what is a state party to the ICC after there's been a collective referral by 7 state parties to the ICC. Yet the ICC was prepared to open an investigation in countries which are not state parties to the ICC, and where the question of jurisdiction was itself questionable. Here, the question of jurisdiction has been acknowledged, really, by the Maduro regime itself. And you've got, as I said, a collective referral. So there are no issues here, and the urgency that is warranted is what should be the first order now for the ICC. Other references on legal remedies, the ICJ complaint that's been mentioned, universal jurisdiction that I mentioned, the United Nations special procedures and special remedies. And as I said, sometimes you need an individual case as a looking glass. In the case of Justice Marie Lourdes Afiuni, her persecution and prosecution for over 10 years now, her torture in detention is a looking glass into the state-orchestrated assault on the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary in Maduro's Venezuela. And finally, we have to continuously, and you know, the testimony that I heard today from my fellow panelists is the thing that moves me and pains me the most, that we have to continuously unmask and expose the state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering, a humanitarian suffering of a scale and a scope and a severity that is not only a threat to the individuals and to the people of Venezuela, but frankly is a threat to the peace and security of the international community. And so I end where I begin. We need a sense of moral urgency, and we need the political will to act.
Thank you, Professor Cutler, and indeed, thank you to all our panelists for contributing your powerful testimonies, which I know means so much for the people of Venezuela, those who are still suffering in Venezuela, and those who are suffering abroad, the millions who've been exiled. I want to thank all of our viewers who span multiple time zones and countries for joining us today. I want to thank again the permanent missions of Honduras, Estonia, and Ukraine, Ambassador Flores for her leadership, and for all the missions taking a principled stand to support human rights for the people of Venezuela and to demand that the United Nations lives up to its founding principles. I want to thank my friend Maria Alejandra Aristiguetes for her support for this event, as for all other of our events for Venezuela, including the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, which has hosted all of the panelists today, including Maria Corina Machado by video in 2015 when she was in hiding. So we've had all of you there. I want to thank Hillary Miller, our New York associate, my colleague, as well as our Chief of Staff, Eileen Ergil Amsalem, for their extraordinary work in organizing this event. To support our campaign, as mentioned, as led by Diego Aria, please go to unwatch.org/expelmaduro. Once again, unwatch.org/expelmaduro. Please sign our petition to show your solidarity with the people of Venezuela and to urge the United Nations to live up to its commitment under Resolution 60/251 to ensure that all members live up to the highest standards of human rights. Thank you all for joining, and have a good day. Thank you.